But neither one of the prosecutors wanted to talk about this dream, because I think they're embarrassed by this. They didn't talk about it. They should be embarrassed. A dream. They listed evidence about some dream. Was it a daydream? Was it a night dream? Was it a nightmare? Was he looking out the window? What did it mean? Even the judge, his instruction, you can totally disregard that. If you got to figure out, who knows what that means? It probably doesn't mean anything, because Shipp did not tell you the truth. If you listen to Carmelita, if you listen to Shirley, if you listen to Miss Eunice Simpson, Shipp was never alone with O.J. Simpson that night. He was an O.J. wannabe, bringing police officers over there, still wanted to be a police officer, off the force for whatever reason, drinking that night, drinking in the past as he said he was. He's not credible, and the evidence he brings is so unreliable, it's so irrelevant that I don't want to spend much of your time with it. But you saw it, you heard them. I ask you to consider Carmelita, Shirley, and Eunice as against Ron Shipp, and I ask you who you're going to believe. I think it'll be no contest. And so you remember what Miss Eunice Simpson said when she said that he seemed a bit spacey, was the way she described it. He was never alone, never talked about any dreams. When Shirley went upstairs with her husband, they spent the night with O.J. Simpson. This was a time for family. This was a time where people gathered around. This is a time for people being sad. They sat on the couch with O.J. Simpson holding his mother's hand. You remember that. My mother always told me that you could tell a lot about a person, about how they treat their mother. You probably have heard that too. And your mother is the one who always comes for you and to you in times of tragedy and stress. True to those words, there was Eunice Simpson, as she is this very day, right there by her son's side, sitting on that couch. Who are you going to believe? Eunice Simpson or Ron Shipp, this wannabe? I submit that you're going to believe Eunice Simpson. She knows her boy. He knows his mother. And then, each of these witnesses who dealt with O.J. Simpson, and let me just quickly come to, and we'll get a logical breaking point so you can get to your dinner. Alan Park, who she placed such great credence in, found O.J. Simpson to be, his demeanor to be normal. You never met him before. He was a normal guy. He was glad to be carrying O.J. Simpson around. The only thing he said was interesting. He said, he said he was hot in the back. Now, O.J. Simpson himself said he was hot in the back of the car. And I thought about this today. And this morning when I was rushing around, trying to get dressed and come to court today to look forward to seeing you all again for another year and a day, I took a shower and I was trying to get dressed, and I kept sweating. I kept sweating. And I thought about how that applies to this case, because we talk about common sense. You ever rush around and take a shower and you're sweating? O.J. Simpson always rushes around, according to his daughter, according to Gigi. Those are the kind of common sense things we know. And so, when we come back this afternoon, we're going to talk about Cato Kalin and how he found O.J. Simpson to be the same O.J. Simpson. And we're going to talk about a range of people who see this man from 11 o'clock on till the next morning till he comes back. We'll take them one at a time, but they all have one thing in common. It's O.J. Simpson. And he's acting normally. He's himself, not acting. And the thing that I think is probably best, and there are a number of good witnesses in that regard, but Howard Bingham is a well-known person around here, and let me end on this point. Howard Bingham gets on the plane, and it was funny because he was in coach, and he wanted to try to explain that to you while he was sitting back there in coach, and O.J. was in first class. And he sees O.J. and he runs up there to say hello to him before the plane takes off, remember? And I asked him, well, how did O.J. Simpson seem to you this evening? He said, it was the same O.J. I've always seen and known. And so rhetorically I ask you again, Howard Bingham, in this area for years, known O.J. for years, Who do you think knows O.J. Simpson better? Howard Bingham or Marcia Clark and Chris Darden? When we come back, we'll answer that question. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the afternoon. Please remember all my admonitions to you. We'll stand in recess until 6 o'clock. All right, have a pleasant evening meal.
And Joe Hines, this is a very accomplished trial lawyer that we're going to see here.
No question. And you know, it's good literature, too. You know, he understands the majesty of language. He understands the need to entertain. And however tacky that sounds, entertainment is very, very important in summations. So I think both of us were amazed that you're allowed to talk about the law in California. You would get murdered in New York State if you ever tried to do that.
Why?
I thought I was in Mars when I was hearing Marcia Clark explaining and detailing the distinction between Murder 2 and Murder 1. And in New York, in federal court, and most jurisdictions that I'm familiar with, that's the province of the court and the court alone.
You know, we see that in California cases, though. Leslie Abramson, I think, hung that jury by emphasizing the circumstantial evidence case.
When Judge Ito decided a motion against the prosecution before the Johnnie Cochran started, there was a detailed discussion about this chart that Blazer said he's used for 5 years. And Judge Ito said, matter of factly, yeah, I've seen that chart before, it's okay. And it was an explanation about, you know, burden of proof and reasonable doubt. And I said to my wife, I said, well, you ever tried that in one of our courtrooms, they throw you out.
All right, well, that's part of the different trial culture in California. They are back in session. We'll go back for more of Johnnie Cochran's summation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is strange to say that, but I appreciate your hanging in there. A little chilly? Okay. All right, Mr. Cochran, you may continue with your closing argument.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad you all came back. I appreciate that. Oh, I guess so. Now, where were we when we left off? We were talking about demeanor. Mr. Simpson's demeanor, and I think I had posed a question with you just before we took our break about Howard Bingham, the photographer who testified here, and I asked you the question, a rhetorical question, about who would know O.J. Simpson the better in his mood and how he appeared on this night, the prosecutors or Mr. Bingham, who'd known him for such a long time. It was a serious question because prosecutors, I presume, never met Mr. Simpson before we started this process. So I think it would be relevant for you to know about how somebody who knew him over a period of time saw him on that particular date, especially when they go into their doctor mode and they use terms like post-homicidal conduct. There's been no testimony in this case at all about post-homicidal conduct and about demeanor, about anybody acts in a post-homicidal conduct. That, again, is more speculation. But what we did in this case was we tried to call for you a number of witnesses who I think bear on this issue of demeanor, which it seems to us is totally relevant. For one thing, it totally rebuts this specious theory about any kind of a fuse or any rage that you've seen. We've done that. We've shared that with you already. And in the course of wrapping that up, keep in mind that both Cato Kalin and Alan Park fall into the category of demeanor witnesses who place Mr. Simpson's demeanor as being entirely appropriate. And these are people's witnesses, so it doesn't matter whether we call the witnesses or they do. If you're in a search for truth, you look and see if there's a common thread of truth that runs throughout these witnesses, and I think we found that. Now, one of the things that I wanted to share with you, yesterday, Ms. Clark, in her argument, tried to indicate something to the fact that Mr. Simpson didn't want Cato Kalin, I believe, to spend time with him or something of that nature, as though he wanted to get rid of Cato Kalin. It was part of her theory there. And I went back and I looked at the testimony at 19854, Ms. Clark herself, when questioning Cato Kalin. When you got to that location, what did you do? When I got to the door, yes, I turned. Okay, what did you see? OJ. And where was he? At the driver's side door of the Rolls. Did you say anything to him? No. What did you do? I looked and said, I'll eat in my room. And then he went off to eat in his room. But there was no further on it says, did you have any conversation with Mr. Simpson? Answer was no. And he said nothing to you? No. So I think that was important to understand and put that record straight, that there was no discussion about whether Cato would go in the house with Mr. Simpson or whatever. They didn't talk. Cato went back to his room. Simpson was still out at his Bentley, presumably trying to get ready to go on this trip, which was long planned. There had been some mention earlier of an argument at a Christmas party. And I wanted to, again, try and set the record straight before we went on with Demeanor, because I pulled up Cato Kalin's testimony again. And what he says was that after question, did everybody go home together? Answer, yes. Everybody celebrate Christmas Eve back at home? Answer, at Rockingham, yes. Question, Nicole, OJ, and the kids? Answer, yes. Question, and yourself? Answer, and Arnell and Jason? Question, whole family? Yes. Now, what they do is they tell you, well, there was an argument at the Jenners, and what they don't tell you was, remember the testimony was, they left the Jenners to go back home because it was Christmas Eve, and they all celebrated Christmas Eve together. So you got to have the whole picture, don't you? Don't you think that seems reasonable? And there was some question about the flashlight, and here's what Cato Kalin had to say about that, where he says, then I said, OJ, do we have a better flashlight? And when I told him about the noise, he was going to take one way, I was going to go another way. But that is when I said, we have this lousy flashlight, we need another one. And so he was going to go inside and check. And then they went in the house, he followed behind. And then that's when Mr. Simpson had to then leave for the airport. So I think that, again, I promised you I would always try to read the actual testimony to make it as clear as I could about where we were. A few other housekeeping things before we get directly into the demeanor aspect. Ms. Clark yesterday had made a number of points about phone calls and boards to Paula Barbieri. And you'll recall we saw a number 305, which I think is in the Miami area code. And I think the evidence is that's a cell phone of some kind. And certainly if you call that phone number out here, you can reach people on a cell phone. And I find nothing unusual about that in regards to the calls that were made. There also was some discussion about what Dr. Batten had to say about these cuts or cut on Mr. Simpson's hand. You recall that Brian Kilberg came back down here again, and he asked some questions of Dr. Batten. And I tried to pull up this testimony so I'd have it clear about when Mr. Simpson had gone to the Bronco to get the portable phone, when he went back to the Bronco apparently to get the paraphernalia in that phone, and try to piece together as to when he got a small cut on his hand, not any large fishhook cut, which I think was clear from the evidence, at what point that he may have bled inside that Bronco and may or may not have known that. And so we read Batten, and this is at page 41182. Question by Mr. Kilberg, I believe. What, if anything, did Mr. Simpson have to say as to the manner when he got the cuts? Answer, that he recalls some blood after trying to retrieve his phone or some material from the Bronco, from a car that he had his phone. I think it was the Bronco, that he'd gone to the Bronco to get something and may have somehow cut himself while getting stuff from the Bronco to bring with him to Chicago. Well, I think that it's important to tie this in with the fact that, remember that Cato Kalin and I think even Alan Park indicated that by the time they were there, when Mr. Simpson finally came down the stairs, when he left, there were bags already down. Certainly the golf bag and this other bag, there were bags already out there. So he'd been outside in that yard, and apparently, according to Ms. Clark's testimony, had been at some point out to the Bronco, and at some point he'd gotten this phone, this portable phone. But we know he'd gotten it because he'd made a phone call on that phone by 10 o'clock or by 10:03. Car wasn't moving. This is a portable phone. And remember, I asked Gigi Guerin, were there any portable phones inside that house. The testimony, there were none. So there was no wireless telephone at Rockingham. So I think the testimony is, and the reasonable inference is, that Mr. Simpson made that cell phone from that location to her cell phone number 305 area code. And then once they left, as I told you, they left with Park, and we know that was around 11:02. So now Mr. Simpson's in the car, and you know how Park describes O.J. Simpson. Nothing out of the ordinary. He says he's hot, but that's nothing unusual. And then Mr. Simpson gets to the airport. Do you remember those two young men who came in? Michael Norris and Michael Gladden. And these are the two airport couriers who were parked at the curb there. And one of them, Gladden, wanted to get Mr. Simpson's autograph. You'll recall that. And so, even though Mr. Simpson was rushed and trying to get to the plane or whatever, he stopped and he gave his O.J. Simpson Peace to You. That was a signature that he gave at about, I think the testimony was 11:25 that particular night on June 12th. That was a testimony of Gladden. Remember, they described O.J. Simpson as being kind of like a model or some kind of a poster boy for these jeans or whatever he had on. I think the way they described it, they felt that he was dressed very neatly, looked very clean, is the way they described him. And he was very approachable. He put some luggage down and then turned around and forgot about the autograph and then gave the autograph. You recall that. It was very interesting because Ms. Clark said yesterday something to the effect, well, Mr. Simpson didn't put on his socks because he left his socks at home. Now, that was one of the most interesting things she said. You've been in this man's closet. You think that O.J. Simpson has one pair of socks? I don't think so. I think you saw his closet. You saw the clothes, the way they were lined up, and the way they were. In fact, remember, I asked the witness the question. Is it trendy? Is it fashionable that a lot of people in that part of town don't wear socks when they get dressed up to go out? Somebody said, yes, that's fashionable. That's what happens. O.J. Simpson has lots of socks. And the evidence is, and it's so interesting, isn't it? Because under the prosecution's theory, if you follow their theory, you're asked to believe that Mr. Simpson is in sweats and tennis shoes, and I presume tennis socks. That he gets this urge to go and kill his wife, and he takes off his tennis shoes and his tennis socks and puts on some dress socks and dress shoes. That doesn't make any sense, does it? But keeps on his sweat clothes according to them. That's how preposterous their theory is, to try to make things fit. And you're going to see, you're going to understand that even better when we talk about these socks. So as O.J. Simpson then gets on the plane. And it was interesting because not only did he deal with Norris and Gladden, but he had an interesting man in the first class across from Steve Valerie. You saw Valerie, a young man who, for pretty much most of that flight, watched O.J. Simpson. Mr. Douglas, what's that number, sir?
1245.
And 1245, it just gives you some idea of this plane. We've talked earlier about Bingham, and remember Valerie was right across from O.J. Simpson as he sat up there in the fourth seat or something like that. And he watched him and noticed him and described for you Mr. Simpson's demeanor. He looked at O.J. Simpson's hands. That was really one of the important things about it. Because again, when Ms. Clark, who was Dr. Clark in this regard, talked to you about this cut or whatever, she was describing how a little cut wouldn't make this amount of blood, but this larger cut. By all of the witnesses who didn't know each other, O.J. Simpson did not have this fish hook cut on his hand when he went to Chicago. That's unanimous. All the witnesses. You heard them. You saw them. Further, you heard the testimony of Drs. Heisinger and Baden, who said this is not consistent with a knife cut. It's consistent with some kind of glass cut because it's raggedy, it's jagged. You remember that? You remember the testimony? And we can prove it further by witnesses who saw him before he was in that room in Chicago and witnesses who saw him after. And we'll talk about that. So on the plane was Bingham, and then we had the pilot on the plane. And the pilot who was flying the plane came back and asked Mr. Simpson to autograph the logbook, which he did, and I think we have a photograph of that. Again, you saw Pilot Stansfield who described how Mr. Simpson was seated there reading a book, a light shining down on him, not trying to hide from anybody, not anything, sitting there reading his book, looked up, talked to the pilot, and gave his autograph, and they both continued on with their business. Then he gets to Chicago and he lands, and he deals with Jim Merrill, the Hertz driver. You'll recall him. The Hertz driver describes the number of bags that Mr. Simpson has. And the luggage when he arrives, he describes the duffel bag, the black duffel bag, the garment bag with OJS, the golf bag, the Louis Vuitton bag. All those bags are described by Merrill. And then, of course, you remember we talked about the knapsack bag, which we think logically had golf balls in it. It was inside the golf bag. So Merrill watched OJ in the luggage area meet with some, I think, say 20 different fans while waiting for his luggage. Merrill says he was friendly, relaxed, and he saw no noticeable cuts on his hands. That's what Jim Merrill told us. This was his testimony. So we brought him here from Chicago to testify in that regard. Now I want you to contrast Mr. Simpson's demeanor and behavior after he goes to this hotel room in Chicago. After he learns of his ex-wife's death, everybody is consistent. And again, these witnesses don't know this person. He was emotional, concerned with a cut finger. Dave Kilduff. And Mr. Simpson gets the call. Here's what I want you to think with me for a moment. I want you to look at how he reacts to this information. We've already covered how his daughter describes him. She's never heard him like this before. He immediately gets plane reservations to come back to Los Angeles. He's then trying to get back, frantically trying to leave this hotel. It's early in the morning. He's trying to get back to Los Angeles on the first thing flying. He's trying to get somebody to take him back to the airport. He's there to play in a golf tournament that day. Obviously, that's never going to happen. So, we know that Dave Kilduff, the Hertz manager, drove Mr. Simpson to the airport. Remember how he describes? Now, this is the first witness. O.J. Simpson's finger is bleeding. And this fishhook cut, this cut that he got in that room when that broken glass was there. But the prosecutors, again, with a cynical view, say, well, that couldn't have happened. Dr. Batten says that in talking to Mr. Simpson, he got that cut when he brushed this glass into the sink. It's entirely consistent. Doctors deal with cuts, and they said this is consistent with a glass cut. Kilduff says that O.J. Simpson is crying and he's upset. He finally makes the plane, and I think it's important to note that when he makes the plane, he sits next to, I think in seat 9, to a lawyer by the name of Mark Partridge, just fortuitous. And I thought it was very interesting about this man Partridge. Remember, he's the man who was a patent lawyer, who'd gone to Harvard, and he observed O.J. Simpson on this flight back. He saw him make these phone calls. He saw his emotional state. He saw him trying to gather information. He saw his finger. He saw the Band-Aid he'd had that came off. He saw that it was cut. You saw his testimony. These were all citizen timeline witnesses, like you or I, who were brought here pursuant to subpoena. They didn't ask to be here. They didn't volunteer. But they had relevant information about what had taken place and what had happened. So it seems to me that we, in our search for justice, in our journey toward the city of justice, must take these witnesses seriously. But you understand, with the power of the state, the prosecution had an equal access to all these witnesses, but they didn't call them. They didn't call them because they didn't fit. They didn't fit and they didn't want to hear. So the prosecutors decided to attack. And you'll remember how these witnesses generally were treated. I thought Partridge was treated especially bad. Here's a man who was so concerned about no one stealing his notes. He wrote notes about what took place. Not to publish them. He's a patent lawyer, so he understood. He put his name in the side, in the margin, to write down his notes, because he knew it would be important. Remember, he said he knew this would be important. And he sent those notes to the prosecution and to the defense. Said, I'm just a witness here. This is what I saw. Can I be of some help? They chose not to call him. They chose to attack him as though he had like something to hide. In fact, remember Ms. Clark standing and saying something to the effect, well, do you know how busy the LAPD was when they didn't have time to respond to you? Well, maybe not. But this was an important witness. That was the only person in the world who sat next to O.J. Simpson on a flight back from Chicago when everything he was doing, continues to do, was consistent with innocence. They didn't want to hear it, but we brought this again for you to hear. And I ask you to judge this witness as you do all the others. You remember Mark Partridge, and I think you will. And remember that it was unfair to attack a witness, a citizen witness, who seemed to be totally objective and careful. Then there was Ken Barris, the police officer in Chicago. Ms. Clark talked about him coming out here, but we brought him out here. We brought Ken Barris out here. He was the police officer who, maybe 3 hours after O.J. Simpson left that room, went into that room at the O'Hare Plaza, was it? 11 o'clock or thereabouts, I believe. He said he went in the room. He found the glass. He found the doily. He found the towel. He found the bedding, because the maids had not done anything with regard to that room. He found this broken glass. And the evidence is, contrary to what the prosecutor would try to tell you, is that this glass was consistent with O.J. Simpson cutting his hand on it. And this is the cut as the fishhook cut. Now, you characterize witnesses like Cato Kalin and Partridge, Denise Pilnack and some others who felt the wrath of the prosecution, and you have to ask yourself why in a search for truth. Why did that happen? Then Mr. Simpson returns back from Chicago. And this was very interesting. And you will recall, because Officer Don Thompson, I saw some of you looking at him, he's a very, very impressive big fellow. He's about 6'7" or 8". He's a big guy. And you remember, he's the officer who was very interesting and very honest. Because he said that immediately upon Mr. Simpson coming back to Rockingham at 12 noon now, on June 13th, what happens? Van Adder had told him to hook him up. Let's see that if we can. We'll give you the number in a minute, Your Honor. You recall that Officer Thompson had testified how he'd been told by Van Adder to hook him up or to handcuff him. He grabbed him by the arm as he went in there. And you recall the photograph. I think that's Thompson there in the background, in the foreground. Thought Mr. Harris had that, but at any rate, you'll recall Mr. Simpson was standing over under a tree and he was handcuffed until the lawyer Howard Weitzman came. You recall that because we saw that during the trial. Howard Weitzman, lawyer, he's talking to Mr. Simpson. You can see that Mr. Simpson is taking how Van Adder's going over to him and taking the handcuffs off, I believe, as the conversation goes on with Howard Weitzman. All right, he's unhandcuffed at this point. Thank you, Mr. That was number 1250, was it? 527. 1250, Your Honor. The point of that was, we have said, and I told you at the beginning and told you in the opening statement and told you again today, this was a rush to judgment. At 12 o'clock on June 13th, Van Adder told Thompson to handcuff O.J. Simpson or to hook him up. Van Adder lied about that because he said in his testimony he never told him that. Thompson was very clear that he told him. He didn't do that on his own. But it shows this rush to judgment. Van Adder did not want to admit that and never